I want to get to the sad quotes. The sad quotes. Billy Graham, in 1963, upon the death of Pope John the 23rd, Graham said from Bonn, Germany, "I admired Pope John tremendously. I felt he brought a new era to the world. It is my hope that the cardinals elect a new pope who will follow the same line as John. It would be a great tragedy if they chose a man who reacted against John." In 1966, Billy Graham said, "I find myself closer to Catholics than the radical Protestants. I think the Roman Catholic Church today is going through a second Reformation." In 1967, Billy Graham said on his graduation speech from Catholic Abbey, quote, "Finally, the way of salvation has not changed. I know how the ending of the book will be. The gospel that built this school, a Catholic school, and the gospel that brings me here tonight is still the way to salvation." He said, Billy Graham said in 1968 in San Antonio, Texas, said that the Roman Catholic Church, quote, "tremendous cooperation in areas where we had held crusades." He said, quote, "A great part of our support today comes from Catholics. We never hold a crusade without priests and nuns being much in evidence in the audience." In 1972, Billy Graham received the Catholic International Franciscan Award for his contribution to true ecumenism and his sincere and authentic ecumenism. He said, "While I am not worthy to touch the shoelaces of St. Francis, yet this same Christ that called Francis in the 13th century also called me to be one of his servants in the 20th century." Can you imagine? Billy Graham received the Catholic International Franciscan Award in Minneapolis, given by the Franciscan friars for his, quote, "contribution to true ecumenism." 1973, Billy Graham was recommended meetings held in North America, especially recommended a biography. Billy Graham recommended a biography of the Pope John the 23rd containing hundreds of passages of devotion, hundreds of pages of devotion to Mary and the saints, worship of the host at the Mass, and his trust in the sacraments as the means of salvation. And Billy Graham advertised this book as, quote, "a classic in devotion." In 1979, it bothers me when spineless believers like Billy Graham. They're spineless. In 1979, the visit of Pope John Paul II to the United States is an event of great significance, not only for Roman Catholics, but for all Americans. This is what he's saying, quote, as well as the world. "In the short time he has been the Pope, John Paul II has become the moral leader of the world. My prayers and the prayers of countless other Protestants will be with him as he makes his journey." In 1979, Billy Graham appeared on the Phil Donahue Show. And in discussing Pope John Paul's second visit to the U.S., he said, quote, "I think the American people are looking for a leader, a moral and spiritual leader that believes something, and the Pope does. Thank God I've got somebody to quote now with some real authority," close quote. 1979, he said, quote, "No other man in the world today could attract as much attention on moral and spiritual subjects as John Paul. He is articulating what Catholic and Protestant churches have traditionally held, the moral values from the Ten Commandments and the Sermon on the Mount. The country is responding in a magnificent way. It shows there's a great spiritual hunger. The Pope has reached millions of Protestants. The organized ecumenical movement seems to be on the back burner, and ecumenicity is now taking place where Roman Catholics and Protestants share beliefs in matters like the virgin birth and the resurrection of Christ." In 1980, Billy Graham said, quote, "Since his election, Pope John Paul II has emerged as the greatest religious leader of the modern world and one of the greatest moral and spiritual leaders of this century. The Pope came to America as a statesman and a pastor, but I believe he also sees himself coming as an evangelist. The Pope sought to speak to the spiritual hunger of our age in the same way Christians throughout the centuries have spoken to the spiritual yearnings of every age by pointing people to Christ." He said, "Recently I learned the word pontiff comes from the Latin words which originally meant bridge builder." Pope John Paul II May be a bridge builder, but he's a bridge builder to hell. In 1981, Billy Graham met Pope John Paul II, and it was reported in the religious news service as saying the intense conversation lasting about 2 hours were very private, intimate conversation. He said, Graham said, he was extremely warm and interested in our work. In 1984, in coming to Vancouver, less than a month after the Pope had been there, Graham commented on the Pope's message. I'll tell you, that was just about as straight an evangelical address as I've ever heard. It was tremendous. Of course, I'm a great admirer of his. He gives moral guidance in a world that seems to have lost its way. In 1986, he said, when he was acknowledging an award, Catholic award, quote, "While I am not worthy to touch the shoelaces of St. Francis, yet this same Christ that called St. Francis in the 13th century also called me to be one of his servants in the 20th century. In 1989, Graham spoke about a meeting with Pope John Paul. Quote, "There was a pause in the conversation. Suddenly, the Pope's arm shot out and he grabbed the lapels of my coat. He pulled me forward within inches of his own face. He fixed his eyes on me and said, 'Listen, Graham, we are brothers.'" 1990, after meeting with the Pope, Graham said that it was particularly evident in the Pope's speeches that his attitudes and decisions are based on his great personal spiritual life. He bases his work and message and vision on biblical principles. This is the traitor, Billy Graham. In 1993, an interview by Joan London on Good Morning America, Billy Graham said, quote, "I'm delighted the Pope is coming. I admire the Pope." Quote, "This past week I preached in the great Catholic cathedral a funeral sermon for a close friend of mine who was a Catholic. And they had several bishops and archbishops to participate. And as I sat there going through the funeral mass, that was a very beautiful thing and certainly straight and clear in the gospel. There was a wonderful little priest that would tell me when to stand and when to kneel and what to do." Interview with Larry King. I thought I had the year, the date here. Quote, this is what he told Larry King. "Tonight, I have when the Pope died, I have a very strange feeling of loss. I almost feel as though one of my family members is gone. I loved him very much and had the opportunity of discussing so many things with him, and we wrote each other several times during the years." Larry King asked, "Did he actually say to you once, 'We are brothers'?" Graham said, "That's correct, he certainly did. He held my hand the first time that I met him about 1981. He'd just been Pope for 2 years when I saw him first, because when he was elevated to the papacy, I was preaching in his cathedral in Krakow that very day. And we had thousands of people in the streets, and watching the television today of Krakow has brought back many memories." King, "You said that he was an evangelist." Graham, "He was indeed. He traveled throughout the world to bring his Christian message to the world. And we see tonight the outpouring from the world that he touched. And I think he touched almost everybody in the whole world. He taught us how to suffer. And I think in recent days, he's taught us how to die." So Larry King said, "There's no question in your mind that he is with God." No, there may be a question about my own, but I don't think Cardinal Wojtyla or the Pope, I think he's with the Lord because he believed. He believed in the cross. That was his focus throughout his ministry, the cross. No matter if you were talking to him from personal issue or an ethical problem, he felt that there was the answer to all our problems, the cross and the resurrection. And he was a strong believer. Larry King, I understand that you've been invited to the funeral, but because of your health, you can't attend. But someone in the Graham family is going to go? Billy Graham said, "That's correct. I don't have the physical strength to go, and I have been invited. I was invited about 6 or 7 months ago by the Vatican ahead of time. And they've asked me that I come, so I asked if I could send my daughter. They wanted a woman to come representing me. So I'm asking my daughter, Ann Lotz, to go, and she's going with an associate of mine. And then my son, Franklin, will be going to the enthronement of the new Pope." The Antichrist. And while Billy Graham was saying all that stuff, Ian Paisley said, quote, "The Scarlet Woman of Rome. Quote, I denounce you, Antichrist. I refuse you as Christ's enemy and Antichrist with all your false doctrine. He said, this Romish man of sin is now in hell. He said, protect us from the shackles of priestcraft. He said, the breath of Satan is upon us.